Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the third Engaged Intelligence podcast about trust. Last week, we talked a bit more of the anatomy of trust. We talked about certain facets like authenticity, consistency, and transparency, and how it shows up in the workplace. We're going on a slightly different tack today, and I'm going to be talking to my co-founder, Ben Chalmers, again, a bit more about autonomy, because based on some of the research that we've been doing, we feel that autonomy is quite a big factor. Personal autonomy or group or team autonomy is quite a big factor in determining trust within an organization. Obviously, it's not the only factor, but it's quite interesting. Respected authors like Daniel Pink have also talked about autonomy and its facets at length. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight in and introduce Ben and ask a question. So Ben, in your experience, having been both in the corporate world and through academia and through other sort of workspaces, what do you think individual autonomy actually means?
Well, I think we should be clear to begin with that there's no such thing as complete autonomy, because everyone is restricted by things such as the laws of physics and the laws of whatever country they're based in. However, within that context, what autonomy means is the freedom to address your work in the way that you find is best for you.
Yeah, that's a very fair definition, and it keeps it simple with a level of clarity. And I think a lot of the time, I know in the work that I do in terms of coaching and developing leaders, we spend a lot of time not so much talking about autonomy, but more setting personal boundaries. And that doesn't mean it necessarily in a defensive way. That means really just getting clarity. And quite often that involves a level of negotiation when you're setting personal boundaries so that everybody knows really what the rules of engagement are. And as you said, there's no such thing as absolute autonomy. If there was, then we'd be on our own. We'd be a bunch of individuals or one individual, and we wouldn't be working as a collective. So I think, like everything, it's heavily nuanced, but there is a relationship there between sort of setting boundaries, both sometimes what we call covert boundaries, i.e. your own personal boundaries that are the limits beyond which you don't want to go or you don't necessarily want other ones to go. And sometimes there are overt boundaries where it's involved in a negotiation on what the boundaries were. And that could be work. So that, again, is quite important. So, yeah, Ben, any further reflections on that?
I think it's important to draw the idea that autonomy and trust are two sides of the different coin, in that the autonomy you may be provided at work should be directly related to the amount of trust that the person who is providing you with the autonomy has in you. In that when you first start working somewhere, you may have not built up a high level of trust with your employer, and there is potentially more need for oversight, more need for checking and monitoring what you're doing. However, if you're able to continually build the consistency that we spoke about earlier, then the trust levels ought to increase, and so your autonomous space ought to widen.
Yes, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I'm glad you brought in consistency there, which again, of course, is one of the facets of trust. Because if you're not being consistent, let's look at the other way, organizations and the individuals you work with may challenge that autonomy, right? They may reel it back in because they're thinking, hang on, this isn't working. Because it is a two-way, it's a two-way street, right? It's a negotiation. And this is, again, goes back to the whole theme of trust. So I think that's a very powerful point that you make about being slightly opposite on the other side of the coins, but linked indirectly. So, in your experience then, Ben, as a follow-on question, what do you think is the best way to grow autonomy in an organization, both collective and individual?
So there are two different sides of this I want to examine. One of them is that many companies treat autonomy as a one-size-fits-all arrangement. In other words, you look at how much you trust perhaps your least trusted individual, and you provide a set of autonomy, you provide a range of autonomy for everyone that's employed, or everyone that's employed at that level, based on how much you trust your least trusted individual. And so other people can build up far more trust, but they then find themselves chafing against the lack of freedom to work in the way they want to work. The other side of autonomy that we should look at in this is that to provide autonomy requires some degree of delegation of responsibility. And when you delegate responsibility, you need to make sure you are also passing on the information that is necessary for somebody else to be able to make the decisions that you make. Many organizations, by not making their top level thinking very transparent, actually prevent people from being able to act autonomously in the best interest of the business.
Yeah, so there's a couple of really powerful points there. Thanks, Ben. First of all, your point about it's not a one size fits all with autonomy. You have to come to a point, and as you say, generally because organizations tend to be more conservative, they'll tend to go to the lower levels of autonomy, which of course, as you've alluded to, may cause frustrations with other employees who want more autonomy. It's quite interesting, just building on that point. A lot of the work that I do when we look at career and career orientations, career development, and leadership and moving through the ranks, is that some people are actually driven by autonomy. And it's quite interesting. We can analyze that, what floats their boat. Is it actually climbing the greasy pole, or is it just having what we call freedom to autonomy, freedom to operate, rather, which you could rate to autonomy. So I think that's a really, a valid point. And that, again, links to the fact that organizations and leaders have to be self-aware of that point and understanding the impacts of where they set those levels of autonomy, in that they, it might enable some well, but it might frustrate others. So I think that's really a really powerful point. And again, I guess it comes back a bit to self-awareness of the organization and the individuals. And to a certain extent, you talked about transparency there, which was your last point, which is really important because, as you say, that's almost akin to, if it's not transparent, people don't know where the boundaries are. So if they don't know where the boundaries are, they can either overstep them, which could be considered inappropriate, or be more conservative than they need to be. So it's a very heavily nuanced topic and problem. So yeah, can you build on that a bit more then, please, Ben?
I can. Something that I was taught quite early on in my career, which I have seen being very important over time, is the idea that there is one particular piece of safety, psychological safety, you need as an individual within an organization more than anything else. And that is the safety to ask your immediate supervisor what you need to do in order to be trusted more. If you have that piece of safety, and if your supervisor is both reliable enough and empowered enough to keep the promise that he makes, then you suddenly have the ability to let every individual figure out how much trust they want to establish in order to gain the autonomy that they feel they need.
Yeah, that's an extremely powerful point, and I'm glad you've made that one, because I was reflecting on the early stages of my career where I wanted to be possibly a bit, pushed a bit harder and given more opportunities. I was lucky enough to have that level of psychological safety, certainly when I graduated, and I was able to have an open dialogue with my supervisors and superiors about more responsibility without fear of sort of retribution. I mean, other times it's been the other way, but that is extremely important. So I'm glad you've raised that. And that sort of leads on to the next point, Ben. I'm going to, the next question I'm going to ask you, because that's very much, to a certain extent, from the employee perspective, right? Let's look at it from an employer's point of view. What in your view would autonomy look like from an employer? And I know this is a very wide subject, arguably nebulous subject, But what do you think an employer is looking for in autonomy?
Well, in an ideal situation, imagine you have the perfect world as an employer. What you ideally want is every employee to be able to act as autonomously as they want to, ideally completely autonomously, because that ultimately reduces the overhead costs of management as you would cease having any form of direction. Of course, we all know there are many things that get in the way of that. We all know that communication and trust are issues that prevent that from working properly. However, what you want to do is get to the level where you can give people as much autonomy as they want while maintaining the level of value production, for want of a better word, that individual is providing to the organization. So an autonomous so ideally in an autonomous organization, you want to be freeing up the constraints on what is stopping somebody providing the most value while limiting them in ways that could cause them to produce less value.
Yeah, no, that's a really powerful point. It's almost again you're exploring is the word I would suggest where those boundaries are of autonomy, both from an employee and employer point of view, that meets the mutual interest, i.e., satisfies the freedom element for the employee, but at the same time meets the requirement for productivity, creativity, unnecessary bureaucracy, for instance, right? When organizations can be overly bureaucratic, but also meet the objective and make sure that people stay true to the path and the objectives of the organization. So that's really useful. And I think hopefully our listeners will find some sense in that. So that's been a really good overview on autonomy today. And thank you, Ben. I think we're getting to a close. So next time we'll be doing a podcast probably in the next 7 to 10 days. We've got to finalize that. We will be looking for a guest and we will be looking for future guests, as we've said before. So thanks again, everybody, for listening. And thanks again to you, Ben, for your critical insights on this very, very important topic relating to trust.
Thank you, John.